The sleek private elevator to the top floor of Bryant Tower pinged softly as the doors opened. Richard Bryant, CEO of Bryant Technologies, stepped out into his penthouse office with the same measured stride he'd used for 20 years. 60 floors below, Manhattan glittered like a circuit board of lights against the fading dusk. At 53, Richard had built an empire worth $4.2 billion. But tonight, his normally keen eyes looked distant as he loosened his tie. "Cancel my dinner with the Japanese investors, Margaret," he said to his assistant, who was gathering her things to leave. "Send my apologies. Something urgent has come up." Margaret nodded, knowing better than to ask questions. In 15 years working for Richard, she'd never seen him cancel on the Takeda Group. Something was wrong. Alone in his office, Richard pulled out the small envelope from his jacket pocket. He'd received it 3 hours ago, in the most unexpected way. A security guard had called up saying there was a child asking to see him personally. Richard had nearly refused until the guard mentioned the child claimed to be delivering something from someone who had died. Curiosity had gotten the better of him. When the elevator doors opened and a small, solemn-faced boy of perhaps 10 stepped into his lobby, Richard had felt an inexplicable chill. "Mr. Bryant?" the boy had asked, voice steady, despite being clearly intimidated by the towering glass and steel surroundings. "Yes, I'm Richard Bryant. My mother asked me to give you this before she died." The boy had held out a simple white envelope, slightly crumpled from being clutched in his small hand. "She made me promise to put it in your hand only, no one else." Richard had taken the envelope, noting the child's serious brown eyes that seemed oddly familiar. "What's your name, son?" "Alex, sir. Alex Winters." The surname had struck Richard like a physical blow. Winters, a name he hadn't heard spoken aloud in almost 11 years. "Where is your guardian, Alex?" Richard had asked, looking past the boy to the empty reception area. "My aunt is downstairs. She didn't want to come up." The boy's voice had dropped to almost a whisper. "She doesn't know what's in the letter. Mom never told anyone. My name is Theo Teller, and if this introduction has already sparked your curiosity, leave your like to follow the unfolding of this extraordinary journey. If you've ever received unexpected news that changed your life forever, subscribe to the channel now and share in the comments what was the most shocking revelation you've ever experienced, just like our protagonist is about to face. Also, let me know which city you're watching this story from. Each message and subscription gives me strength to bring more stories that will stir your emotions. Now, Richard stood at his floor-to-ceiling windows, the city lights blurring as he stared at the envelope. The handwriting on the front simply said Richard in a feminine script he recognized immediately. His hands trembled slightly as he carefully opened it. Inside was a single sheet of paper, folded around a small photograph. As the photo slipped out onto his desk, Richard's breath caught. It showed a woman he once knew intimately, Katherine Winters, holding a baby wrapped in a blue blanket. On the back, written in the same elegant handwriting, were the words, "Alex, age 3 months, your son." The letter itself was brief but devastating in its simplicity. "Richard, if you're reading this, I've lost my battle with cancer. I never told you about Alex because by the time I discovered I was pregnant, you were engaged to Charlotte. I couldn't bring myself to disrupt the future you'd chosen. But Alex deserves to know his father, and you deserve to know your son. He's a remarkable boy with your mind and determination. Please don't punish him for my silence. Always, Katherine." Richard collapsed into his chair, the letter falling from his fingers. Memories flooded back. Katherine's laugh, their passionate but brief affair during a project in Boston, the abrupt way she'd left the company and disappeared. He'd searched for her initially, confused by her sudden departure, but then life had carried him forward. His engagement to Charlotte, the daughter of his biggest investor, the merger that had catapulted Bryant Technologies into the stratosphere of tech companies, the marriage that had ended in a bitter divorce after only 4 years. And now this, a son, A 10-year-old boy with serious eyes and his mother's quiet dignity, waiting somewhere with an aunt who likely resented the very existence of Richard Bryant. Richard's hand hovered over his phone, uncertain who to call first. His lawyer, security to find the boy, or should he simply go downstairs himself? A strange paralysis gripped him as the magnitude of this revelation settled over his consciousness like a heavy fog. He picked up the photograph again, studying the woman in the image. Katherine had been brilliant, an environmental scientist he'd hired as a consultant for a controversial clean energy project in Massachusetts. Their connection had been immediate and undeniable, intellectually and physically, but she'd been adamantly opposed to corporate entanglements, passionate about maintaining her independence. When she vanished without explanation, he'd assumed she'd found their relationship too constraining. Never once had he imagined a child. The intercom buzzed, pulling Richard from his thoughts. "Sir," came the voice of the night security manager. "There's a woman in the lobby asking about the boy who came up earlier. She says she's his aunt, and they need to leave." Richard pressed the intercom button. "Tell her I'm coming down." He gathered the letter and photo, sliding them back into his jacket pocket. His heart was hammering against his ribs with a force he hadn't felt in years. The elevator descent felt interminable. Richard tried to compose himself, to summon the cool executive demeanor that had served him through countless high-stakes negotiations. But this wasn't business. This was a what? Fatherhood thrust upon him without warning, a legal complication, a second chance. When the doors opened to the marble expanse of the Bryant Technologies lobby, Richard immediately spotted them. The boy, Alex, sat on one of the minimalist benches, swinging his legs slightly, while a tired-looking woman in her early 40s checked her watch impatiently. "Excuse me," Richard approached them, his voice not entirely steady. "I'm Richard Bryant." The woman turned, her eyes widening slightly as she registered his presence. Unlike the boy, whose features carried hints of Richard's own, this woman bore a striking resemblance to Katherine, the same delicate nose and determined chin. "Mr. Bryant," she said coolly, "I'm Susan Winters, Katherine's sister. I apologize for the intrusion. Alex insisted on delivering that letter personally, and Her voice broke slightly. "I couldn't deny him his mother's last wish." Richard nodded, struggling to find appropriate words. "I appreciate you bringing him. This is unexpected." "I imagined so," Susan replied with a hint of bitterness. "Katherine never wanted to burden you. Even at the end, she almost changed her mind about the letter." Alex looked up, his gaze moving between the adults with the shrewd assessment of a child who had learned to read emotional currents. "Did you know my mum?" he asked Richard directly. The simple question carried the weight of a decade of absence. Richard knelt down to meet the boy's eyes. "Yes, I did. Your mother was an extraordinary woman, very intelligent and brave. She said you were smart too," Alex said. "She said I got my math brain from you." Richard felt something constrict in his chest, pride and grief tangled together. Up close, he could see more clearly the resemblance, the shape of the eyes, the serious set of the mouth. His son. The concept still felt foreign, almost theoretical, despite the living proof before him. "When did your mother?" Richard couldn't complete the question. 3 weeks ago," Susan answered, her expression softening slightly at the genuine emotion she saw in Richard's face. "Pancreatic cancer. It was quick at the end." Alex's small face remained composed, but Richard recognized the effort it took to maintain that control. He'd perfected the same mask himself as a child after his own father's abandonment. "I'd like to talk more," Richard said, addressing both of them. "Perhaps we could go somewhere more comfortable. There's a cafe still open on the second floor." Susan hesitated, checking her watch again. "It's getting late, and Alex has school tomorrow. We should get back to our hotel." "Hotel?" Richard asked. "We live in Chicago now," Susan explained. "We're only in New York until Friday to settle Katherine's affairs." The temporary nature of their visit sent a jolt of urgency through Richard. His son, A boy he hadn't known existed mere hours ago would disappear back to Chicago in just 2 days unless he took action. "Please," Richard said, surprising himself with the earnestness in his voice. "Just a short conversation. I've just learned I have a son. I'd like a chance to at least begin to know him." Susan's protective instinct was evident in her stance, but Alex spoke up before she could refuse. "I want to talk to him, Aunt Susan," he said quietly. "Mom wanted me to know him. She told me so." Susan relented with a small nod. "Half an hour. Then we really must go." As they walked toward the executive elevator that would take them to the upscale cafe, Richard felt a storm of emotions he'd long suppressed. Shock and disbelief were giving way to something more complex, a mixture of anger at Katherine for her secrecy, grief for what they had all lost, and an unexpected surge of protective instinct toward this solemn child who carried his DNA. His phone vibrated in his pocket, likely his executive team questioning his abrupt cancellation, or perhaps Charlotte with another demand regarding their divorce settlement. For the first time in his career, Richard Bryant let it ring unanswered. Some priorities transcended business. The cafe on the second floor of Bryant Tower was nearly empty at this hour. A single barista looked up in surprise as Richard Bryant himself walked in, accompanied by a woman and child. Richard nodded at the young man, who immediately straightened his posture. "We'll take a table in the back, Jake," Richard said, recognizing the night worker. "Could you bring us—" He glanced at Susan questioningly. "Just tea for me," she said. "And hot chocolate for Alex, if they have it." "Hot chocolate and tea," Richard confirmed. "And coffee for me. Thank you." They settled at a corner table far from the entrance. The awkwardness between them was palpable as they arranged themselves. Alex sliding into the booth next to his aunt, Richard taking the seat opposite them. For a man who commanded boardrooms with ease, Richard found himself uncharacteristically tongue-tied. Alex broke the silence. "Mom kept a picture of you in her desk drawer," he said matter-of-factly. "Not out where people could see it, just in her special box with her important things." Richard wasn't prepared for how these simple words would affect him. "She did? It was from a magazine," Alex continued. "Fortune or something. You were on the cover." Susan interjected gently. "Katherine never spoke badly of you, Mr. Bryant." She was very clear with Alex that her choices were her own. The implication hung in the air that Katherine had chosen to keep Alex a secret, chosen to raise him alone rather than disrupt Richard's life. The nobility and the tragedy of that decision struck Richard anew. "I would have helped," Richard said quietly, "regardless of my other commitments at the time." Susan's expression suggested skepticism, but she remained polite. "Katherine believed you were on an important path." She didn't want to complicate that. Their drinks arrived, creating a momentary diversion. Alex wrapped his small hands around the hot chocolate mug, leaving a smudge on the ceramic. Richard noticed the boy's fingernails were bitten down, a sign of anxiety he recognized from his own childhood. "Alex," Richard ventured carefully, "your mother's letter mentioned you're good at maths?" The boy nodded, a hint of animation entering his features. "I'm in advanced math at school, 2 grades ahead." "He's being modest," Susan added with a touch of pride. "He's something of a prodigy with numbers. Katherine always said he got that from his father." Richard felt a complex emotion grip him. Pride mingled with regret for the years of achievements he'd missed. "I was the same at your age," he told Alex, "always fascinated by patterns and equations." "Mom said you built computers when you were a kid," Alex said, his voice revealing the first real enthusiasm since their meeting. "I did," Richard confirmed, leaning forward slightly. "My first was at 12, nothing fancy by today's standards, just basic programming and primitive graphics." "I'm learning Python," Alex volunteered, his eyes brightening. "At the coding club after school." Richard couldn't help the smile that spread across his face. Python's an excellent language to start with, very intuitive. For a brief moment, the tension eased as they discussed coding and Alex's interest in computational mathematics. Richard found himself impressed by the boy's knowledge and quick understanding. The resemblance went beyond physical traits. Alex had inherited Richard's analytical mind and curiosity, but the comfortable moment was short-lived. Susan checked her watch pointedly, reminding them of their time constraint. Richard cleared his throat. "I'd like to see you again before you leave New York," he said, directing his words to both of them, but focusing on Alex. "Perhaps tomorrow, if that's possible. I could show you some of the technology we're developing. We have a virtual reality lab that might interest you." Before Susan could respond, Alex asked bluntly, "Are you going to be part of my life now?" The directness of the question caught Richard off guard. He looked into the boy's serious eyes and knew that a superficial answer wouldn't suffice. This child had just lost his mother. He deserved honesty. "I would like to be," Richard answered carefully. "I understand this is very sudden, and there's a lot we all need to figure out. But yes, Alex, if you're open to it, I want to know you and be part of your lives." Alex considered this with a maturity that belied his years. "Mom said you might say that. She said you were honorable, even if you were ambitious." Richard felt a lump form in his throat at Katherine's assessment of his character, more generous than he probably deserved. Susan interjected, her voice gentle but firm. "There would be practical matters to consider, Mr. Bryant. We live in Chicago. Alex has school, friends, his therapy sessions." "Therapy?" Richard questioned softly. Susan's expression softened. "For grief counseling, since Katherine's diagnosis." Richard nodded in understanding. The complexity of the situation was becoming clearer. This wasn't just about acknowledging a biological connection. This was about a child who had suffered a profound loss, whose entire support system was centered in another city. "I understand," Richard said, "and I respect that Alex's stability is the priority. But perhaps we could start with regular visits. I travel to Chicago frequently for business." Alex looked up at his aunt, a silent question in his eyes. Susan sighed, her protective instincts warring with the recognition that her nephew deserved this connection. "We could try that," she conceded. "Visits, to begin with." Richard felt a strange mixture of relief and anxiety. The prospect of integrating a child into his meticulously ordered life was daunting, yet the alternative, letting Alex return to Chicago and potentially losing touch with him, felt infinitely worse. "There's something else you should know," Susan said, lowering her voice. "Katherine didn't leave much behind financially. The medical bills, they took everything. That's partly why we're here in New York, to clear out her apartment and sell what we can." Richard understood the unspoken message. Katherine had never asked for his money, even when facing catastrophic illness. The pride and independence that had defined her in life had persisted until the end. "That's something I can help with immediately," Richard said firmly. "And I want to. Not just financial support, but ensuring Alex has everything he needs for his education, his future." As their brief meeting drew to a close, Richard felt the weight of 10 lost years pressing on him. So much time that couldn't be recovered, so many moments missed. But there was still time ahead. Time to know this remarkable child who carried his blood and Katherine's spirit. The following morning, Richard woke before his 5 a.m. alarm for the first time in years. Sleep had eluded him, his mind racing with the implications of Katherine's revelation. He'd spent hours researching paternity laws, scrolling through parenting resources, and even looking up schools in the Chicago area near where Susan had mentioned they lived. By 6:30 a.m., he was already in his office, instructing his personal attorney, James Wilson, to clear his schedule for an emergency meeting. "Should I be concerned?" James asked, as he settled into the chair across from Richard's desk. "That depends," Richard replied, sliding Katherine's letter across to him. "Read this." James adjusted his glasses and read quickly, his practiced neutral expression slipping slightly as he absorbed the contents. "I see," he said finally. "And you believe this claim is legitimate?" "I have no doubt," Richard said firmly. "The timing aligns. The boy," he paused, correcting himself. Alex, my son. He has my features, my aptitudes. Katherine wouldn't lie about something like this. James nodded thoughtfully. What do you want to do? Everything, Richard said with uncharacteristic emotion. DNA test first, to make the legal aspects straightforward. Then I want to establish financial support immediately. Trust fund, education account, medical coverage. And I want to begin custody discussions. James raised an eyebrow. Custody? Richard, you've just learned about this child. Joint custody is a significant step, especially with a boy who's already established in another city. I know it's complicated, Richard acknowledged, but I've lost 10 years, James. I don't want to lose any more time. The attorney made a note. The aunt is the current guardian? Temporarily, it seems. From what I gathered, she stepped in after Katherine's death, but there's no formal arrangement yet. The legal situation is fluid. That could work in your favor, James said carefully, but I caution against moving too aggressively. Courts favor stability for the child, and disrupting his current living situation could be seen as destabilizing, regardless of your biological connection. Richard nodded, acknowledging the wisdom in this advice, despite the impatience surging through him. Set up the DNA test today, if possible, and I want to establish the financial support, regardless of how the custody discussions proceed. B. As James gathered his notes, Richard's executive assistant Margaret knocked and entered with a concerned expression. Sir, the Takeda Group is quite upset about last night's cancellation. Mr. Takeda himself is asking for an explanation. For the first time in his career, Richard Bryant found he didn't particularly care about mollifying an important business partner. Reschedule for next week. Family emergency. Margaret blinked in surprise at the mention of family, but nodded and withdrew discreetly. You've never used that excuse before, James observed after she left. It's not an excuse this time, Richard replied. After James departed with his instructions, Richard found himself standing at his office windows again, looking out at the city sprawling below. The empire he'd built seemed suddenly different in context, not meaningless, but incomplete. He'd created Bryant Technologies with single-minded focus after his divorce, pouring every waking hour into expansion and innovation. The success had been extraordinary, but hollow in ways he'd refused to acknowledge. His phone buzzed with Susan Winter's number. They'd exchanged contact information at the cafe the night before. This is Richard, he answered immediately. Mr. Bryant, Susan's voice came through, sounding slightly hesitant. Alex asked if we could take you up on your offer to visit your company today, if that's still possible. Richard felt an unexpected rush of anticipation. Absolutely. What time would work best for you? They arranged for a 1 p.m. visit, giving Richard time to prepare both his schedule and himself. After ending the call, he did something unprecedented in his routine. He left the office. His driver, Michael, couldn't hide his surprise when Richard instructed him to take him to the upscale children's department at Saks Fifth Avenue. Sir? Michael questioned, thinking he'd misheard. Saks, Richard confirmed. I need to purchase something for a 10-year-old boy. The confusion on Michael's face might have been comical in other circumstances. At the store, Richard found himself standing awkwardly in a department he'd never had reason to visit before. A helpful sales associate approached, sensing his discomfort. Can I help you find something specific, sir? Richard hesitated. What did one buy for a newly discovered son? I need a gift for a 10-year-old boy who's interested in coding and mathematics. The associate smiled. We have some excellent tech-oriented options. There's a build-your-own computer kit that's very popular with that age group. By the time Richard left the store, he'd purchased not only the computer kit, but also several books on coding for young people, a high-end tablet preloaded with educational apps, and a quality backpack to contain it all. The extravagance of the gesture wasn't lost on him. He was trying to compensate for a decade of absence with material goods. Yet as Michael placed the packages in the car, Richard felt a strange sense of satisfaction mixed with his anxiety. For the first time in years, he was making decisions that weren't calculated for business advantage or public perception. Stories like this remind us of the power of unexpected connections that can reshape our lives. If you believe in second chances, consider subscribing to not miss the upcoming twists in this journey. Your support helps bring these touching stories to light, reminding us all that life's most profound moments often arrive when we least expect them. Back at Bryant Tower, Richard instructed his team to prepare the innovation lab and clear the executive floor of all non-essential personnel. He didn't want Alex's visit to become a spectacle or subject of office gossip. Then he returned to his office to prepare himself for what might be the most important meeting of his life, not with investors or board members, but with a 10-year-old boy who carried half his genetic code and all of Katherine's dignity. At precisely 1 p.m., Richard's private elevator opened to reveal Susan and Alex. The boy looked different today, more alert, his serious eyes taking in the sleek executive floor with undisguised curiosity. He wore a simple blue button-down shirt and khaki pants that Richard guessed were his good clothes, perhaps purchased for the funeral. "Welcome to Bryant Technologies," Richard said, feeling oddly formal despite the personal nature of their connection. He approached them, deliberately slowing his usual brisk stride. "Did you find the building okay?" "The cab driver knew exactly where to go," Susan replied. "He seemed impressed we were meeting you personally." Alex looked up at the massive abstract painting dominating the reception area. "Did you paint that?" he asked, pointing to Richard's signature discreetly placed in the corner. Richard was surprised by the observation. "Yes, actually, it's a hobby I don't get much time for anymore." "Mom painted too," Alex said quietly. "She said it helped her think when science problems got too tangled." The casual revelation created another thread of connection between Katherine and himself that Richard hadn't known existed. They'd shared so little time together, just those intense 3 months during the Boston project, yet their similarities ran deeper than he'd realized. "Would you like to see some of our projects?" Richard offered, gesturing toward the innovation wing. "We're working on some exciting new technologies." Alex nodded, his reserve giving way slightly to genuine interest. As they walked through the sleek corridors, Richard found himself explaining their latest developments in terms a child could understand, something he rarely did for adult visitors. To his surprise, Alex asked perceptive questions that reflected real comprehension. "This is our virtual reality lab," Richard announced as they entered a large space with an open central area surrounded by workstations. "We're developing applications that go beyond gaming, medical training, architectural design, even therapy for anxiety disorders." A young engineer named Priya approached them with a VR headset. "Would you like to try our newest prototype?" she asked Alex, with a quick glance at Richard for permission. For the first time, Richard saw a genuine smile light up Alex's face as he nodded eagerly. Susan looked worried. "Is it safe for children?" she asked. "Absolutely," Priya assured her. "This program was specifically designed with younger users in mind. It's an educational simulation of marine ecosystems." As Alex donned the headset and began the ocean exploration program, Richard moved to stand beside Susan, who was watching her nephew with a mix of caution and affection. "Thank you for bringing him today," Richard said quietly. Susan sighed, her shoulders relaxing slightly. "He was excited, though he tried not to show it. He's been so stoic since Katherine." She trailed off, blinking rapidly. "How are you holding up?" Richard asked, realizing he hadn't considered how Katherine's sister must be grieving while simultaneously taking on responsibility for a child. The question seemed to catch Susan off guard. "I'm managing," she answered after a moment. "Katherine was always the strong one, the brilliant one. I'm just trying to honor what she would have wanted." Which was? For Alex to be happy, to have opportunities. Susan looked directly at Richard. To know his father, apparently, though she waited until the very end to decide that. There was hurt in her voice, but not accusation. Richard sensed that Susan had her own unresolved feelings about Katherine's choices. Did she tell you? About me, I mean. Before the end? Susan shook her head. Not until the last week. She just said Alex's father was someone she'd cared for deeply, but the timing had been wrong. I assumed it was the professor she'd dated after moving to Chicago. She laughed mirthlessly. I nearly fell off my chair when she mentioned your name, Richard Bryant, tech billionaire. I thought the pain medication was making her hallucinate. Richard winced, both at the reminder of Katherine's suffering and at the characterization. I wasn't always this, he said, gesturing vaguely at their surroundings. When I met Katherine, Bryant Technologies was just getting established. She knew me before all this. Does that matter? Susan asked, not unkindly. It did to her, I think, Richard replied. Katherine valued authenticity. She could see through pretense like no one else I've known. They both turned to watch Alex, who was reaching out to touch virtual sea creatures, his expression of wonder visible despite the headset covering half his face. For a moment, he looked like any other 10-year-old, unburdened by loss or adult complications. I've scheduled a DNA test, Richard said, keeping his voice low. Not because I doubt, but to establish legal paternity. My lawyer is preparing documents for financial support. I want to make sure Alex has everything he needs. Susan nodded slowly. Katherine would appreciate that. She was too proud to ask for help, even when the medical bills started piling up. I wish she had, Richard said, a trace of anger seeping into his voice. I wish she'd given me the chance to help her, to know my son. Before Susan could respond, Alex removed the VR headset, his eyes bright with excitement. That was amazing, he exclaimed. I could see everything. Coral reefs, deep sea vents, even a blue whale. I'm glad you enjoyed it, Richard said, genuinely pleased by the boy's enthusiasm. The programmers spent months getting the details accurate. Could I learn to make something like that? Alex asked. With time and practice, absolutely, Richard assured him. Virtual reality development combines coding, mathematics, and creative design, all skills that can be learned. Mom said you started coding when you were my age, Alex said, looking at Richard with new interest. That's right, on a much more primitive system than we have now, but the basic concepts haven't changed. As they continued the tour, Richard noticed Alex gradually relaxing, asking more questions, even occasionally walking beside Richard rather than staying close to his aunt. It was a small shift, but significant. In the robotics lab, Alex was particularly fascinated by a prosthetic hand project that could be controlled by neural signals. Richard explained how the technology might help people who had lost limbs regain function. That's what Mom worked on, Alex said suddenly, using plants to clean up pollution. She said technology should help solve problems, not just make money. The comment, clearly a direct quote from Katherine, hit Richard with unexpected force. It reflected her values perfectly and also served as a gentle rebuke to some of the more profit-driven decisions of his career. Your mother was right, Richard said after a moment. The best innovations serve a greater purpose than financial gain. Susan gave him an appraising look, as if trying to determine whether he truly meant what he said or was simply being diplomatic. As they completed the tour and returned to Richard's office suite, he retrieved the packages he'd purchased earlier. I have something for you, Alex, he said, feeling unexpectedly nervous. Just a few things I thought you might enjoy. Alex accepted the bags with surprise. Thank you, he said politely, looking to his aunt for permission to open them. Susan nodded, and Alex carefully began unpacking the gifts. His eyes widened at the computer kit and books. This is really for me? He asked, holding the build-your-own computer box reverently. All of it, Richard confirmed. I thought we might work on the computer together sometime, if you'd like that. The offer hung in the air between them, not just a suggestion about a gift, but an opening toward a relationship, a future with shared experiences. Alex looked up, meeting Richard's gaze directly. I'd like that, he said simply. For Richard, those 3 words carried more weight than any major business deal he'd ever closed. But the moment of connection was fleeting, as Susan gently reminded them of the time. We should be going, she said. We have an appointment with Katherine's attorney at 3. Richard nodded, reluctantly accepting the interruption. Of course. Could we meet again tomorrow? Perhaps dinner at my apartment? It's just upstairs. Susan hesitated, but Alex spoke up. Please, Aunt Susan. I want to show him my coding project. Susan relented with a small smile. All right, dinner tomorrow. As they prepared to leave, Alex suddenly turned back to Richard. Mr. Bryant. Yes, Alex? You can call me Dad if you want, the boy said with a surprising directness. I know you are my dad. Mom always told me my father was a good man who didn't know about me. She never lied about that. The simple statement, delivered with a child's honesty, nearly undid Richard's carefully maintained composure. Thank you, Alex. That means a lot to me. After they left, Richard sat at his desk, staring at the space where his son had stood. The day had brought unexpected progress, small openings in the walls of caution that naturally existed between them. But Richard knew the path forward would not be straightforward. There were legal questions, practical considerations about Alex's life in Chicago, and the delicate matter of how to integrate a child into his high-profile existence without exposing Alex to unwanted attention. And beneath all these pragmatic concerns lay the deeper challenge: how to become a father to a boy who had already formed his identity without Richard's influence, how to honor Katherine's memory while establishing his own relationship with their son. The meeting with Katherine's attorney had yielded troubling information. Richard learned this the following afternoon when Susan called him just hours before their scheduled dinner. There are complications, she explained, her voice tight with stress. Katherine's medical debts are even worse than I thought. The hospital is filing claims against her estate. What estate? Richard asked, momentarily confused. I thought you said she had nothing left. Just her apartment in Chicago, and some research patents that never yielded much income, Susan clarified. But it's Alex's inheritance, all she had to leave him. The attorney says we'll likely have to sell everything to cover the medical costs. Richard felt a surge of anger, not at Susan or even the hospital, but at the circumstances that had kept Katherine's illness hidden from him. I'll take care of it, he said firmly. Mr. Bryant, Richard, please. Richard, Susan corrected herself. I appreciate the offer, but these are substantial debts. We're talking hundreds of thousands of dollars. I understand, Richard replied calmly. I'll have my finance team handle it immediately. Consider it resolved. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Why would you do that? Susan finally asked, her tone suggesting genuine confusion rather than suspicion. Richard considered the question carefully. Because Katherine shouldn't have had to face that alone. Because those debts shouldn't consume what she wanted to leave for Alex. And because, he hesitated, then finished honestly, because I want to do something for her, even if it's too late. Another silence. Then Susan sighed. Katherine was right about you, she said softly. What do you mean? She said, beneath all the ambition, you had integrity, that you always did what you believed was right, even when it was difficult. The assessment touched Richard deeply. Katherine had seen him more clearly than he'd realized, despite their brief time together. We'll still come for dinner tonight, Susan added. Alex has been talking about it all day. After ending the call, Richard immediately contacted his legal team to begin the process of settling Katherine's medical debts. Then he cleared his evening schedule and left work early, another unprecedented departure from routine, to prepare his penthouse apartment for dinner guests, specifically for a 10-year-old boy. Richard's home occupied the top 3 floors of Bryant Tower. Designed by a celebrated minimalist architect, it featured soaring ceilings, museum-quality art, and furnishings selected more for their aesthetic value than comfort. Looking at it now through the imagined eyes of a child, Richard realized how cold and impersonal it would appear. On impulse, he called his executive assistant. "Margaret, I need you to arrange something immediately." An hour later, Richard surveyed the transformation of his formal dining room. The intimidating 20-person table had been replaced with a smaller, more intimate setting. The sterile white orchids that usually served as centerpieces had been swapped for colorful arrangements. Most significantly, a corner of his living room now contained an impressive gaming setup, the latest console, multiple controllers, and a selection of age-appropriate games. When his private elevator chimed at 6:30, Richard felt an unfamiliar flutter of nervousness. He straightened his casual sweater, another departure from his usual formal attire, and went to greet his guests. Alex emerged first, his eyes widening as he took in the expansive penthouse with its wall-to-wall windows showcasing the New York skyline at dusk. "Whoa," he breathed. "You live all the way up here?" "I do," Richard confirmed, pleased by the boy's reaction. "The view is even better from the terrace, though it's a bit cool tonight." Susan followed, carrying the tablet Richard had gifted Alex the day before. "He wanted to show you his coding project," she explained with a small smile. "He's been working on it all afternoon." Dinner began somewhat stiffly, with conversation limited to safe topics like the food and the view. But as the meal progressed, Richard found himself genuinely interested in hearing about Alex's life in Chicago, his school, his friends, the science club where he'd begun learning programming. "And how do you like living with your aunt?" Richard asked carefully, aware he was approaching sensitive territory. Alex glanced at Susan before answering. "It's okay. Aunt Susan's apartment is smaller than Mom's was, but she fixed up the spare room for me." Susan looked slightly embarrassed. "It's a work in progress. I wasn't exactly prepared for parenthood." "Few people are," Richard said kindly, thinking of his own total unpreparedness. "Even with 9 months' notice." The small joke broke some of the tension, drawing a brief smile from Susan. "I miss my friends," Alex admitted, "and my coding club, and Mr. Whiskers." "Mr. Whiskers?" Richard inquired. "Our cat," Alex explained. "He had to go live with our neighbor because Aunt Susan's building doesn't allow pets." Richard noted the way Alex said, "our cat," preserving the connection to the home and life he'd shared with Katherine. He also noticed Susan's expression, guilt mixed with helplessness, the look of someone doing their best in impossible circumstances. "What's going to happen to Mom's apartment?" Alex asked suddenly, his direct gaze moving between the adults. "Are we going to sell it?" Susan hesitated, clearly caught off guard by the question. "I'm not sure yet, honey. There are some bills we need to take care of first." "Of the hospital bills?" Alex asked with the perception of a child who had absorbed more adult concerns than he should have needed to. "I heard you talking to the lawyer about them." Richard intervened gently. "Those bills are being taken care of, Alex. You don't need to worry about that." Alex looked at him sharply. "Are you paying them?" "Yes," Richard answered honestly, seeing no benefit in evasion. "Because I'm your son." The directness of the question and the perceptiveness behind it struck Richard. This was Katherine's influence, the unflinching pursuit of truths. "Partly," Richard acknowledged, "but also because your mother deserved the best care possible, and neither of you should have had to worry about the cost of that." Oh. Alex seemed to consider this, his expression serious beyond his years. Oh. Mom worried about money a lot. She didn't think I knew, but I heard her on the phone sometimes. Susan reached over to squeeze his hand. Your mom was very brave, Alex. She wanted to handle everything herself. Too brave, Richard said quietly. Then to Alex. Would you like to show me your coding project now? The change of subject lightened the mood. Alex eagerly retrieved the tablet and moved to sit beside Richard on the couch, their shoulders nearly touching, as the boy demonstrated the simple game he'd been programming, a maze with increasingly difficult levels. It's not finished yet, Alex explained, showing Richard the code he'd written. I'm still trying to fix the collision detection. Richard was genuinely impressed, both by the sophistication of the project for a 10-year-old and by the methodical way Alex walked him through the code. You've done excellent work here, he said. Very clean organization. Alex beamed at the praise. Can I show you something else? I made a virtual model of a bacterium for my science project last year. As the boy navigated to another program, Richard became aware of Susan watching them from across the room, a complex emotion on her face. When Alex became absorbed in explaining his science project, Richard caught her eye questioningly. You look so much alike when you're focused on something, she said softly. The same expression, the same way of leaning forward. Richard hadn't considered the physical resemblance beyond the general features he'd initially noticed. The idea that they shared mannerisms, genetic echoes that had developed independently, was both fascinating and poignant. The evening progressed more comfortably than Richard had dared hope. After Alex had exhausted his desire to share his digital projects, Richard showed him the gaming system, which elicited genuine excitement. Soon, Richard found himself being thoroughly trounced at a racing game by his 10-year-old son, a new and not unpleasant experience. Susan, watching from a nearby armchair, seemed to relax as well, occasionally offering commentary on Alex's competitive tactics. He gets that from Katherine, she observed after Alex had executed a particularly ruthless overtaking maneuver. She was merciless at board games. As the evening drew to a close, Richard found himself increasingly reluctant to see them leave. Tomorrow was their final day in New York before returning to Chicago, a reality he had been trying not to dwell on. I had DNA samples taken today, he told Susan quietly, while Alex was absorbed in one final game. The results should be back quickly. I'd like to begin formal arrangements for financial support and, he hesitated, then pressed on, and visitation rights. Susan studied him, her initial wariness now tempered with something like cautious approval. You're serious about being in his life? Completely, Richard confirmed. I've missed too much already. She nodded thoughtfully. It won't be simple. He's still processing Katherine's death, adding such a significant change to his life. It will be challenging. I understand that, Richard said. I don't want to disrupt his stability, but I also don't want to be a distant figure who appears occasionally with gifts and then disappears. What are you proposing exactly? Richard had been considering this question intensively. Initially, regular visits. I can come to Chicago frequently. Perhaps Alex could spend some school breaks here in New York, and I'd like to be involved in decisions about his education, his activities. Shared custody, Susan clarified. Eventually, yes, if Alex is comfortable with that arrangement. Susan sighed, but not unhappily. Katherine would be pleased, I think. She worried about him growing up without a father figure. That's why she finally decided to tell you. As they prepared to leave, Richard noticed Alex yawning despite his attempts to hide his fatigue. On impulse, Richard knelt to the boy's eye level. I've enjoyed this evening very much, Alex. Thank you for sharing your projects with me. Alex regarded him solemnly. Will I see you again before we go back to Chicago? Absolutely, Richard assured him. "I thought perhaps we could spend the day together tomorrow, if that's okay with your aunt." Susan nodded her agreement. "We don't fly out until the evening." "There's something I'd like to show you," Richard told Alex. "Something special." As the elevator doors closed on Susan and Alex, Richard felt a strange mixture of emotions: satisfaction at the progress they'd made, anxiety about their limited time, and a deep, aching awareness of how much Katherine's absence permeated every aspect of this new relationship. She should have been here, guiding their son's introduction to his father, offering her wisdom and perspective. Richard returned to his suddenly quiet apartment and went directly to his study. From a drawer, he retrieved a small wooden box he hadn't opened in years. Inside were mementos from his time with Katherine, a few photographs, ticket stubs from a concert they'd attended, and most precious now, a handwritten note she'd left on his pillow the morning after their first night together. Even practical minds need to dream sometimes. Thank you for reminding me. K. Richard ran his finger over the elegant script, so similar to the handwriting on the letter Alex had delivered. In her final act of motherhood, Katherine had given both Richard and Alex a precious gift, the chance to know each other. But she'd also presented Richard with an implicit challenge: to become worthy of being the father of Katherine Winter's son. The location Richard had chosen for their final day together was not what Susan had expected. Instead of another corporate showcase or upscale Manhattan venue, Richard had asked his driver to take them to a modest brownstone in Brooklyn. The building looked well-maintained, but unremarkable among its neighbors on the tree-lined street. "What is this place?" Susan asked as they approached the front steps. "My first real home," Richard answered, producing a key that looked worn with age. "I haven't been back in nearly 15 years. Alex studied the building with undisguised curiosity. "You lived here before you were rich?" Richard smiled at the blunt phrasing. "Yes, long before. This is where Bryant Technologies was born, literally in the basement of this house." He unlocked the front door, revealing an interior that contrasted sharply with his current minimalist penthouse. Though clean and well-kept, the home had a lived-in quality, with comfortable furniture, bookshelves overflowing with technical manuals, and walls covered with framed patents and early company milestones. "I've kept it exactly as it was," Richard explained, moving through the space with a reverence that surprised Susan. "My first real success came from here, and I never wanted to forget that." Alex wandered into what had clearly been a home office, examining the now vintage computer equipment with fascination. "This stuff is ancient," he exclaimed, running his fingers over a bulky monitor. "Cutting edge when I bought it," Richard said with a laugh. "That system cost every penny I had at the time. I slept on a futon in the corner for 6 months because I couldn't afford both a bed and that computer." Susan observed the interaction with growing interest. This was a side of Richard Bryant that didn't appear in magazine profiles or business news coverage, the struggling entrepreneur before he became the polished CEO. She'd assumed his pristine image had been carefully crafted, but the genuine affection with which he showed Alex around the old home suggested otherwise. "Why did you want to show us this place?" she asked quietly, while Alex examined a wall of early coding printouts. Richard considered the question. "I wanted Alex to know where I came from, that I wasn't always—" He gestured vaguely at himself, at the expensive watch and tailored casual clothes that marked his current status. "I want him to know the full story, not just the successful ending." The sincerity in his voice disarmed Susan's lingering skepticism. She'd been preparing herself for the inevitability of Richard's involvement in Alex's life while maintaining a protective wariness. But the man who stood before her, watching his newly discovered son with vulnerable hope, seemed genuinely determined to build something real with Alex. "Come downstairs," Richard called to Alex. "There's something special I want to show you." They descended into what had once been a typical Brooklyn basement, but had been transformed into a workshop. Unlike the rest of the house, which had been preserved in its original state, this room showed signs of more recent use. Workbenches lined the walls, covered with tools and electronic components. In the center stood what appeared to be an early prototype of a robotic arm. "I still come here sometimes," Richard admitted, "when I need to think or build something with my own hands instead of directing others. No one at the company knows about this place." Alex approached the robotic arm with obvious fascination. "Did you make this?" "I did," Richard confirmed. "It was an early attempt at the technology we refined for the medical prosthetics you saw at the lab." "Does it work?" "See for yourselves." Richard pressed a switch, and the arm whirred to life, moving through a series of pre-programmed motions with mechanical precision. Alex's eyes widened with delight. "That's awesome! Can you show me how it works?" What followed was the most animated Susan had seen either of them. Richard guided Alex through the basic principles of the robotics, simplifying complex concepts without talking down to the boy. For his part, Alex absorbed the information with remarkable comprehension, asking questions that revealed his quick grasp of the underlying concepts. "You have a natural talent for this," Richard told him, unable to hide his pride. "It took me months to understand some of these principles when I was teaching myself." Alex beamed at the praise. "Mom said I should be an engineer. She said I have the right kind of brain for solving problems." "Your mother was very wise," Richard said softly, "and she was right about you." As the morning progressed into afternoon, Susan found herself increasingly a spectator to the growing connection between father and son. When Richard opened a cabinet to reveal a collection of small robots and electronic kits from his own youth, Alex's excitement was palpable. "I've kept these all these years," Richard explained. "I always thought—" He stopped, a shadow crossing his face. What?" Alex prompted. "I always thought I'd share them with my child someday," Richard finished quietly. "I didn't know then that child would be you, but I'm very glad it is." The simple statement hung in the air, its emotional weight tangible. Susan saw Alex swallow hard, struggling with the complex feelings the words evoked. "I'd like you to have these," Richard continued. "All of them. We can ship them to Chicago or keep them here for when you visit." "When I visit?" Alex asked, latching onto the implication. "You want me to come back?" Richard knelt to meet his son's eyes directly. "Alex, I want very much to be part of your life, in whatever way works best for you and your aunt. I know Chicago is your home, and I would never want to disrupt that, but I hope you'll visit often, and I'll come to Chicago regularly." Alex looked to Susan, silently seeking her guidance on this monumental shift. She nodded encouragingly. "We can make arrangements if that's what you want." "I think I'd like that," Alex said cautiously, turning back to Richard. "But I have questions." "Ask me anything," Richard responded, his expression open and vulnerable in a way Susan suspected few people ever witnessed. "Why didn't you and Mom stay together?" The directness of the question clearly caught Richard off guard, but he recovered quickly. "Your mother and I knew each other for only a short time during a project she consulted on. We came from different worlds and had different priorities then. I was focused on growing my company, and Katherine was dedicated to her research." But you liked each other?" Alex pressed. Richard's expression softened. "Very much. Your mother was extraordinary, brilliant, and principled. She changed how I thought about many things." "Then why didn't you look for her when she left?" Susan tensed, recognizing they'd reached sensitive territory, but Richard didn't falter. "I did, initially. But Katherine made it clear she wanted space, and I respected that. Then my company expanded rapidly. I became engaged to someone else." He paused, seeming to realize these weren't adequate explanations to a child. "The truth is, I should have tried harder. That's one of my biggest regrets." Alex absorbed this, with the solemn intensity that characterized many of his reactions. I think Mom regretted it too, he said finally. She kept your picture. Richard nodded, his composure slipping slightly. Alex, I want you to know something important. If I had known about you, nothing would have kept me from being in your life. Nothing. The conviction in his voice was undeniable. Even Susan, who had initially harbored doubts about his intentions, could not question the sincerity of his statement. Alex studied Richard's face for a long moment before responding. I believe you, he said simply. The admission seemed to break something open between them. Alex stepped forward and, with the awkward hesitation of unfamiliarity, put his arms around Richard in a brief but determined hug. Richard's surprise was evident, but he recovered quickly, returning the embrace with careful restraint, as if afraid Alex might shatter or withdraw. Over the boy's head, his eyes met Susan's, and she saw in them a mixture of gratitude and wonder. The moment passed quickly, Alex pulling away with the self-consciousness of pre-adolescence. But something fundamental had shifted. When they moved upstairs for the lunch Richard had arranged to be delivered, the conversation flowed more naturally, with Alex voluntarily sharing stories about school and his friends in Chicago. As they were finishing their meal, Richard's phone buzzed with an incoming message. He checked it briefly, then looked up with a significant expression. The DNA results just came in, he said. It's official, though I never doubted it. We're father and son. The clinical confirmation seemed almost anticlimactic after the emotional connection they'd already begun to forge. But Richard understood its practical importance. With legal paternity established, he could move forward with the arrangements for support and visitation. What happens now? Alex asked, perceptive as always to the undercurrents of adult concerns. Now we make plans, Richard answered. I'll talk with your aunt and with some lawyers about the best way to support you while respecting your life in Chicago. I'll visit as often as I can, and you'll come to New York when it works for your schedule. And we'll build robots, Alex asked, a hopeful note in his voice. Richard smiled, his face transforming from the stern CEO the public knew to someone much warmer. Absolutely. We'll build amazing things together. The moment was interrupted by Susan checking her watch. We should start heading back to Manhattan to get our bags from the hotel. Our flight's at 7. Reality reasserted itself. In just a few hours, Alex would be returning to Chicago. The progress they'd made suddenly seemed fragile against the geographical distance that would separate them. Richard addressed the concern directly. I have something to ask both of you, he said, his tone becoming more formal. I'd like to come to Chicago this weekend. Just for a couple of days, to see where you live, maybe meet Alex's friends, start understanding his life there. Susan and Alex exchanged looks of surprise. This weekend? Susan asked. That's very soon. I know, Richard acknowledged. But I don't want to lose momentum. This matters too much. Alex's expression had brightened considerably. Could you come to my school? There's a science fair on Friday. I was going to skip it because... He trailed off, the unspoken reason hovering between them. Because his mother wouldn't be there to see his project. I would be honored, Richard said, his voice thick with emotion. If that's okay with your aunt. Susan found herself nodding despite her initial instinct toward caution. The hope in Alex's eyes made hesitation impossible. That would be fine, but there's something else we need to discuss before you come. Richard raised an eyebrow questioningly. The apartment, Susan clarified. Katherine's apartment. I've been delaying making decisions about it because it's Alex's home, and I hated to disrupt that further. But we can't maintain 2 residences indefinitely. Understanding dawned on Richard's face. You've been staying at Katherine's place with Alex, Susan nodded. It seemed easier for him, surrounded by familiar things. But I need to return to work soon, and my apartment is closer to both my job and a good school for Alex. What if you didn't have to choose? Richard suggested. What if I purchased Katherine's apartment? Alex could maintain his connection to his home, and you wouldn't have the financial burden of two places. The offer was generous, perhaps extravagantly so, but Susan sensed it wasn't made from a place of showing off wealth. Richard genuinely wanted to preserve something precious for his son. That's a significant commitment, she said carefully. Everything about this is significant, Richard replied simply. I've missed 10 years. I don't want Alex to lose anything more if I can prevent it. As they prepared to leave the Brooklyn brownstone, Richard took one last look around the space that had witnessed the beginning of his success. I bought this place when everyone told me I was taking too big a risk, he told Alex. It was the first time I trusted my own judgment over others' doubts. Was it scary? Alex asked. Terrifying, Richard admitted with a smile. But the best decisions often are. Susan watched them descend the front steps together, noting how Alex had unconsciously adopted Richard's posture, shoulders straight, head held at a similar angle. Nature asserting itself, creating connections despite the years of separation. In the car returning to Manhattan, Alex fell asleep against the window, exhausted by the emotional intensity of the past few days. Susan seized the opportunity to speak privately with Richard. He's still grieving, she said quietly. He puts on a brave face, but he cries at night. I want to make sure you understand what you're taking on. Richard nodded soberly. I do, and I'll be patient. I don't expect to replace Katherine or to immediately become the father he deserved to have all along, but I want to be there through all of it. The grief, the adjustment, everything. You're not what I expected, Susan admitted. What did you expect? Someone more corporate, less genuine. She gave him a small, apologetic smile. Katherine always spoke well of you, but I assumed she was romanticizing the past. And now, Susan studied the man beside her, powerful and privileged, yes, but also revealed today as surprisingly human. Now I think she understood you better than most people do. Udi. As the car approached their hotel, Richard glanced at his sleeping son and made a decision that would have shocked his board of directors, his executive team, and the business press that had chronicled his ruthless rise to success. I'm coming with you, he announced quietly, to Chicago, today. Susan blinked in surprise. But you haven't packed, arranged your schedule. I can buy what I need there, Richard said dismissively, and schedules can be changed. I've realized something important today, Susan. All these years building Bryant Technologies, I was creating something I thought would be my legacy. But it's not. He is. He gestured toward Alex. Everything else can wait. The science fair at Westridge Elementary School was in full swing when Richard arrived. The gymnasium buzzed with the excited energy of children proudly displaying their projects, while harried teachers attempted to maintain order. Parents clustered in supportive groups, smartphones raised to capture their children's moments of academic glory. Richard paused at the entrance, suddenly acutely aware of how out of place he looked. Despite his attempt at casual attire, jeans and a simple button-down shirt, he still carried himself with the unmistakable bearing of someone accustomed to authority. Several curious glances were already being directed his way. Mr. Bryant, Alex's voice cut through the crowded space. The boy waved enthusiastically from a booth in the far corner, his face alight with an excitement Richard hadn't seen before. As Richard made his way through the maze of volcanic models and plant growth experiments, he felt a strange constriction in his chest. This was a milestone moment, the first time he would be publicly acknowledged as Alex's father, though they had agreed to be discreet about the specifics of their sudden connection. Richard would be introduced as Alex's biological father, who had recently come into his life. You came, Alex said, as Richard reached his booth, the simple statement carrying layers of meaning. Despite Richard's promises and his dramatic decision to fly to Chicago with them 3 days ago, part of Alex had clearly feared disappointment. I wouldn't miss it, Richard assured him, taking in the impressive display before him. Alex's project was markedly more sophisticated than those surrounding it. A computer simulation demonstrating how different environmental factors affected the spread of harmful bacteria in water systems. This is remarkable work, Richard said, genuinely impressed as Alex walked him through the simulation parameters. The program was far more advanced than what most fifth graders could produce, showing not only Alex's coding skills, but also his understanding of environmental science. Katherine's influence clearly evident. Mom helped me start it, Alex explained, a momentary shadow crossing his face. Before she got really sick, I finished it after. Richard placed a gentle hand on his son's shoulder, feeling the slight tremor that ran through the boy at the mention of his mother. She would be very proud of what you've accomplished, he said quietly. Alex nodded, his composure returning as a teacher approached their booth. Alex, I'm so glad you decided to participate after all, the woman said warmly, before turning curious eyes to Richard. Ms. Patel, this is my dad, Alex said, the word still awkward on his tongue. He came from New York to see my project. Richard extended his hand. Richard Bryant, it's a pleasure to meet you. Ms. Patel's eyes widened slightly in recognition of the name, but she maintained her professional demeanor. Alex is one of our most talented students, she told Richard. His understanding of computational science is exceptional. I'm not surprised, Richard replied, unable to keep the pride from his voice. He comes by it naturally. As Ms. Patel moved on to other exhibits, Richard became aware of increased attention from nearby parents. Whispers and glances were being directed their way, prompting him to ask, "Is this uncomfortable for you?" The attention. Alex considered the question with his characteristic thoughtfulness. A little, he admitted. But it's better than before. Before. After Mom died, everyone looked at me like I was going to break. Well, they didn't know what to say, so they avoided me. He adjusted a component of his display with precise movements. This is different. The insight into Alex's recent experiences added another layer to Richard's understanding of his son's resilience. Before he could respond, a small group of children approached the booth, led by a freckled boy with unruly red hair. Is it true? The red-headed boy asked bluntly, looking between Alex and Richard. Is he really your dad? Alex straightened, meeting his friend's gaze directly. Yes, this is my biological father, Richard. Richard noticed the careful terminology, biological father, language that had likely been discussed with grief counselors and Susan to help Alex process the complex situation. The boy studied Richard with undisguised curiosity. Alex said you're super rich and you make robots and stuff. Is that true too? Despite the awkwardness of the situation, Richard couldn't help but smile at the direct question. I run a technology company that works on various innovations, including robotics. And yes, I've been fortunate in business. This seemed to satisfy the boy, who turned back to Alex. That's pretty cool. Are you still coming to my birthday next weekend? The normality of the question, this glimpse into Alex's regular life, touched Richard deeply. These were the everyday moments he had missed for 10 years. Yeah, if that's still okay, Alex replied, glancing uncertainly at Richard. Of course it's okay, Richard assured him quickly. Your regular activities don't change because I'm here. As the science fair continued, Richard observed Alex in his element, confidently explaining his project to judges, interacting with friends, navigating his school environment with quiet confidence. This was a side of his son he hadn't seen in New York, where Alex had been subdued by griefs and the strangeness of their first meetings. Susan joined them later, having arranged to take a long lunch break from her first day back at work. "How's it going?" she asked Richard quietly, as Alex demonstrated his project to another group of students. "He's amazing," Richard replied simply. "So poised, so intelligent." Susan smiled, some of her initial wariness having softened during the past few days of observing Richard's genuine commitment. "Katherine did a wonderful job with him." "She did," Richard agreed, a familiar pang of regret hitting him at the mention of Katherine. "I wish I could tell her that." "I think she knew," Susan said softly. "She wouldn't have reached out to you otherwise." Their conversation was interrupted by the announcement of the science fair winners. Richard held his breath as the judges moved through the grade categories, eventually reaching 5th grade. And the first place winner for 5th grade is Alex Winters, for his computational model of bacterial spread in water systems. The pride that surged through Richard was unlike anything he'd experienced in his most significant business triumphs. He watched as Alex accepted his blue ribbon with a modest smile, his eyes immediately seeking Richard in the crowd. Richard gave him a thumbs up, fighting an unexpected tightness in his throat. In that moment, standing in a school gymnasium surrounded by science projects made of cardboard and construction paper, Richard Bryant felt success in a way his billions had never provided. The rest of the day passed in a blur of introductions to teachers and parents, careful explanations of Richard's sudden appearance in Alex's life, and quiet observations of his son in his natural environment. By the time they left the school, Richard had a much clearer picture of Alex's daily life, his friends, his academic strengths, the supportive community Katherine had built around him. That evening, they returned to Katherine's apartment, where Richard had been staying in the guest room rather than at a hotel. The 3-bedroom condo in a pleasant Northside neighborhood was modestly furnished, but filled with books, scientific journals, and the subtle touches that reflected Katherine's personality. Natural materials, earth tones, and splashes of vibrant color in unexpected places. Richard had felt her presence strongly when he first entered the apartment 3 days ago. Now, as he helped Alex prepare dinner, another new experience for the CEO who rarely cooked for himself, he found himself addressing Katherine silently in his thoughts. "I'm trying to do right by him. I hope you can see that, wherever you are." After dinner, while Susan took a work call, Richard and Alex settled in the living room with the computer kit Richard had given him in New York. They had agreed to work on it together, and Alex had been eagerly awaiting this promised activity. As they unpacked components and began following the assembly instructions, Richard noticed a photograph on the bookshelf that he hadn't seen before. Katherine holding a much younger Alex on her lap, both of them laughing at something off camera. The joy captured in that frozen moment was palpable. "That's from when I was 6, Alex said, noticing Richard's gaze. "We were at the lake house that Uncle David owns. Mom was laughing because I caught a tiny fish and was super excited about it. She had a beautiful smile," Richard said softly. Alex nodded, returning his attention to the circuit board in his hands. "She didn't smile as much when she got sick." He made the statement factually, without visible emotion, but Richard recognized it as an opening, an invitation to talk about Katherine. "Was she sick for a long time?" Richard asked gently. "Not really, just since January." Alex's focus on the components intensified, his fingers working with careful precision. "It happened really fast. One day she was helping me with homework, and the next day she couldn't get out of bed." Richard absorbed the timeline, calculating that Katherine had learned of her illness just months before her deaths, and had waited until the very end to reach out to him. The thought sent a fresh wave of sadness through him. "She tried to hide how bad it was," Alex continued, his voice steady but quiet. "But I could tell. She kept having to go to the hospital, and then she stopped coming home at all. Richard set down the instruction manual, giving Alex his full attention. That must have been very difficult for you. Alex shrugged, but the casual gesture couldn't mask the pain beneath. Aunt Susan stayed with me, and I visited Mom every day after school. Were you there when... Richard couldn't bring himself to complete the question. When she died, Alex finished, looking up at last. No, she made Aunt Susan take me home. She said she didn't want that to be my last memory of her, but I think she just didn't want me to see her afraid. The insight was startlingly mature and utterly heartbreaking. Richard fought to maintain his composure, knowing that Alex needed his strengths, not his griefs. Your mother was very brave, he said finally. She was, Alex agreed. Then with the direct gaze that reminded Richard so much of Katherine, he asked, "Are you going to stay? Not just tonight, I mean. Are you going to keep being my dad, even when it's not easy?" The question struck at the core of Richard's own unspoken fears, that he would fail at this most important role, that his business would pull him away, that he would prioritize the wrong things, as he had so often in the past. Yes, he answered with quiet conviction. I'm going to stay in your life, Alex. I won't pretend it will always be simple. I have responsibilities in New York, and your life is here, but we'll figure it out together. You're my son, and that doesn't change, no matter what. Alex studied him with that searching gaze that seemed to see beyond Richard's words, to the intention behind them. Whatever he found there must have satisfied him, because he nodded and returned to the circuit board. I think this goes here, he said, pointing to a connection point. Richard recognized the shift back to safer ground and followed his lead. You're right. And then we need to attach the power source here. They worked in companionable focus for the next hour, the complexity of the kit providing a shared challenge that bridged the remaining awkwardness between them. When they finally powered up the completed base unit and saw the indicator lights blink to life, Alex's triumphant smile was the most unguarded expression Richard had seen from him. We did it, Alex exclaimed, his excitement momentarily erasing the solemn maturity he usually displayed. You did most of it, Richard corrected, ruffling his son's hair impulsively. You have a natural talent for this. The casual physical affection seemed to surprise Alex, but he didn't pull away. Instead, after a brief hesitation, he leaned slightly against Richard's side in a tentative acceptance of the gesture. The moment was interrupted by Susan's return. Looks like you two have been busy, she observed, taking in the completed kit and the scattered packaging. We got it working on the first try, Alex told her proudly. Dad says the next part is programming it to do simple tasks. Richard felt something shift inside him at Alex's casual use of dad, the first time he had used the term directly rather than talking about Richard in the third person. From Susan's raised eyebrows, she had noted the change as well. That's wonderful, she said, but it's getting late and you have math tutoring tomorrow morning. Alex's face fell slightly. Can't we do a little more programming tonight? I think your aunt's right, Richard said, though he was equally reluctant to end their time together. We can continue tomorrow. The programming part requires clear thinking. As Alex gathered the instruction manual and components, carefully organizing them for the next day's work, Richard saw another glimpse of himself in his son's methodical approach. Nature expressing itself through nurture, genes manifesting despite separation. After Alex had gone to bed, Richard and Susan sat at the kitchen table, the serious conversation they'd been postponing now unavoidable. I've spoken with my attorneys, Richard began. They've drafted financial support documents that should cover everything Alex needs: education, healthcare, activities, housing. I'd like you to review them with your own lawyer. Susan nodded, her expression thoughtful. And the custody arrangement? I'd like to start with regular visitation, me coming here frequently, Alex visiting New York during school breaks. Eventually, we might consider more formal shared custody, but only when Alex is comfortable with that. And what about your work, your life in New York? Being a parent isn't something you can schedule at your convenience, Richard. The question was direct, but not unkind. Susan had moved from suspicious wariness to cautious alliance over the past few days, but her primary concern remained Alex's well-being. I'm making changes, Richard replied. I've already spoken with my executive team about restructuring my responsibilities to allow more remote work and flexible travel. Bryant Technologies existed before I became so hands-on with daily operations, and it can adapt to my reduced presence now. Susan looked surprised by the extent of his commitment. That's significant. Alex is significant, Richard said simply. Then, after a moment's hesitation, he added, There's something else I want to discuss. The apartment. You mean buying Katherine's place? I've been thinking about your offer, and while I appreciate not just buying it, Richard interrupted gently, living here, part-time at least. I've been looking into establishing a Chicago office for Bryant Technologies. We've been considering Midwest expansion for years, and this would give me a legitimate business reason to be here regularly. Susan set down her teacup with deliberate care. He would relocate part of your company to be near Alex. I would do what's necessary to be present in his life, Richard confirmed, not in an intrusive way, and certainly not to disrupt the stability you've provided. But yes, I'm committed to making this work. Susan was quiet for a long moment, studying Richard with the same thoughtful intensity Alex often displayed. Katherine would be pleased, she said finally. She worried about him being raised without a father figure. That's why she made the decision to contact you, even though she knew it might complicate things. I'm grateful she did, Richard said softly, though I wish that she'd told you sooner. Susan finished. Richard nodded, the familiar regret washing over him. We lost so much time. Katherine made her choices for reasons that made sense to her, Susan said. She wasn't perfect, but she always put Alex first. In the end, that included letting you into his life. As they continued discussing practical arrangements late into the night, Richard felt an unfamiliar sensation settling over him, a sense of rightness, of pieces falling into place after being misaligned for years. The complicated reality of co-parenting with his deceased former lover's sister lay ahead, with countless details to negotiate and boundaries to establish. But the core truths remained simple and profound. He had a son, and nothing would ever be the same again. 6 months had passed since that fateful day when Alex had delivered Katherine's letter. The seasons had changed, summer fading into a crisp Chicago autumn, and with them, gradual but profound transformations had taken root in 3 intertwined lives. Richard stood at the window of what had once been Katherine's home office, now converted into his remote workspace. The view overlooked a neighborhood park where children played among trees ablaze with red and gold. He'd spent more time in Chicago than New York over the past months, his presence in Alex's life evolving from novelty to something approaching normal. Dad, Alex's voice called from the living room. I finished the code revision. I think I fixed the bug. The ease with which Alex now used the term Dad still gave Richard a small thrill each time he heard it. Their relationship had developed through a careful dance of connection and space, with both Richard and Susan vigilant about allowing Alex to set the pace of their growing bond. Let's take a look, Richard replied, joining his son at the dining table, where Alex had set up his laptop. The boy had inherited Katherine's environmental interests, along with Richard's technological aptitude, and was developing a sophisticated simulation of ocean current patterns and their impact on marine ecosystems. Richard pulled up a chair, noting how Alex's posture straightened with pride as he displayed his work. "See, I rewrote this section to account for the temperature variables." Examining the code, Richard felt the now familiar surge of mingled pride and amazement. At 11, Alex was programming at a level that would impress many of Richard's professional developers. "This is excellent work," he said sincerely. "You've solved the problem in a very elegant way." And Alex beamed at the praise, his confidence in sharing his accomplishments with Richard growing stronger with each passing week. Their mutual interest in technology had provided the initial bridge, but their relationship had gradually expanded to encompass broader aspects of Alex's life. Homework help, weekend outings, even the occasionally awkward but increasingly comfortable conversations about school social dynamics. The front door opened, and Susan entered carrying groceries. "How are my two favorite programmers doing?" she called cheerfully. The domestic routine they had established still occasionally struck Richard as surreal. This approximation of family life so different from his solitary existence in New York or his previous marriage, which had been more business partnership than intimate connection. "Alex just solved a rather complex coding issue," Richard informed her, helping to unpack the shopping bags. "I'm thinking we have a future chief technology officer here." Susan smiled, but Richard noticed the slight shadow that crossed her face, the same expression that occasionally appeared when discussions of Alex's future arose. Despite the detailed legal agreements they had established regarding shared responsibility for Alex, Susan sometimes still feared losing her place in his life as Richard's involvement deepened. "Speaking of the future," Susan said, placing a school information packet on the counter, "Westridge is hosting an advanced placement information night next week for middle school planning." Richard nodded, making a mental note to adjust his schedule. These school meetings had become priority commitments, his calendar now organized around Alex's activities rather than board meetings or investor calls. The shift had raised eyebrows among his executive team initially, but Richard's uncharacteristic yet unyielding stance had eventually silenced questions. After dinner, while Alex video chatted with a school friend about their science project, Richard and Susan sat on the balcony with cups of tea, the evening air carrying the first hint of approaching winter. "I received the finalized trust documentation today," Richard said, breaking their companionable silence. "Everything's set up as we discussed: education funding through graduate school, healthcare coverage, the investment portfolio that will mature when he's 25. Susan nodded appreciatively. "Katherine would be amazed at the opportunities he'll have." After a pause, she added, "You've exceeded all my expectations, you know. When you first appeared, I was certain you'd make grand gestures and then gradually fade away." Richard acknowledged her candor with a small smile. "That was a reasonable assumption based on my reputation. But you proved me wrong," Susan continued. "You've been present in ways that matter, not just financially but emotionally. Alex notices that." The validation warmed Richard, particularly coming from Susan, whose initial skepticism had evolved into a partnership he deeply valued. The co-guardianship arrangement had developed its own rhythm, Susan providing the continuity and daily stability Alex needed, Richard contributing his time, resources, and gradually a paternal influence that filled a void neither of them had fully recognized until it began to heal. "There's something I've been meaning to discuss with you," Richard said, setting down his cup. "The Chicago office expansion is proceeding well. The team has found a suitable location and will begin operations after the new year." Susan studied him thoughtfully. "That's becoming more than just a convenient excuse to be near Alex, isn't it?" Richard nodded, acknowledging the insight. "Bryant Technologies needs a stronger Midwest presence, but yes, it's evolved into something more significant. The distance from New York headquarters has provided perspective." What kind of perspective? Susan prompted. Richard considered how to articulate the transformation that had been quietly unfolding within him. For years, I measured success by market share and profit margins, building something bigger, more influential, more lucrative than my competitors. Since meeting Alex, he paused, searching for the right words. I've started questioning what I want my legacy to truly be. Susan listened attentively, the wariness that had characterized their early interactions now replaced by genuine respect. And what have you concluded? That I want to redirect more of our research resources towards sustainable technology, medical applications, innovations that solve real problems. The kind of work Katherine would have valued. The mention of Katherine no longer brought the sharp pain of regret it once had. Instead, her memory had become a gentle guiding influence, her values continuing to shape their son's life and, increasingly, Richard's own priorities. She would appreciate that, Susan said softly. Their conversation was interrupted by Alex, joining them on the balcony, laptop in hand. Dad, can I show you something? I found some of Mom's old research papers online. Richard made room on the bench, and Alex settled between them, bringing up a scientific journal article with Katherine's name among the authors. This one's about phytoremediation, using plants to remove contaminants from soil. Mom explained it to me before, but I didn't really understand the chemistry then. As Alex walked them through the paper, his understanding clearly more advanced than it had been months ago, Richard was struck by the boy's determination to maintain his connection to Katherine while simultaneously embracing his new relationship with his father. Rather than compartmentalizing these aspects of his life, Alex had begun integrating them, finding comfort in the continuity between his mother's scientific legacy and his father's technological expertise. Later that evening, after Alex had gone to bed, Richard made a phone call he'd been contemplating for weeks. His chief financial officer answered despite the late hour, accustomed to Richard's unconventional work schedule. Jim, I need you to set up a foundation, Richard said without preamble. The Katherine Winters Environmental Research Foundation, initial endowment of $20 million, with annual funding commitments to follow. There was a brief pause on the line. That's substantial, Richard. The board will have questions. The board will approve it, Richard replied with the quiet confidence that had built his empire. This isn't negotiable. I want scholarship programs, research grants, with a particular focus on the intersection of environmental science and technology. After concluding the call, Richard moved through the apartment, checking locks and turning off lights. Another domestic routine that had become surprisingly comfortable. He paused at Alex's partially open bedroom door, peering in to see his son sleeping peacefully, the soft glow of a moon-shaped nightlight casting shadows across the room. On the bedside table sat two framed photographs, one of Katherine holding a younger Alex, both smiling brightly, and beside it, a newer image of Alex and Richard taken at the Bryant Technologies Chicago site selection, both looking serious and then breaking into laughter at something off camera, past and present side by side. The next morning brought an unexpected challenge. As Richard prepared breakfast, another skill he'd developed in recent months, Susan entered the kitchen with a concerned expression. Alex's therapy session has been moved up today, she said, and I have a deposition I can't reschedule. Would you be able to take him? Richard hesitated. Though he had gradually taken on more parental responsibilities, he had yet to participate in Alex's grief counseling sessions, recognizing the delicate nature of that healing process. Of course, he said, setting aside his uncertainty. Should I stay in the waiting room or... Dr. Patel actually suggested you might join for part of the session, Susan replied, if you're comfortable with that. The prospect was daunting. Grief was territory Richard had historically avoided through work and detachment, but he understood its importance to Alex. Whatever will help him. 2 hours later, Richard found himself sitting beside Alex in a comfortably furnished office, Dr. Patel observing them with professional warmth. Alex has been doing very well with processing his griefs, she explained to Richard. But we've been discussing the importance of creating connections between his past and present. He thought you might help with that. Alex looked up at Richard expectantly. I told Dr. Patel about how we've been working on coding projects together, like Mom and I used to do science experiments. Richard nodded, understanding the thread Alex was drawing between these experiences. Your mother nurtured your curiosity. I'm trying to do the same. Dr. Patel smiled encouragingly. Alex, would you like to share what you were telling me about the memory box? Alex straightened, his expression turning serious. I made a box of memories about Mom, important things that helped me remember her. And I've been thinking, maybe we could make a Winters Bryant family history, with stuff from both sides. The suggestion caught Richard off guard, this explicit linking of their separate histories into a shared narrative. I'd like that very much, he said, his voice thick with emotion. Perhaps, Dr. Patel suggested gently, you could share with Alex some memories of your own childhood, Richard. The connections he might find there could be very meaningful. Richard nodded, though the prospect of revisiting his own past, much of it painful, was uncomfortable. My childhood was very different from yours, Alex, he began cautiously. My father left when I was young, and my mother worked multiple jobs to support us. Alex listened with rapt attention as Richard shared carefully selected stories from his youth. His early fascination with computers, his mother's sacrifices to buy him his first programming books, the scholarship that had changed the trajectory of his life. So, you didn't have a dad either? Alex asked, making connections Richard hadn't explicitly stated. Not after I was 8, Richard confirmed, which is part of why being your father means so much to me. I know what it's like to miss that relationship. By the time the session ended, something profound had shifted between them. The shared vulnerability had created new dimensions to their bond, moving beyond their common interests to a deeper emotional connection. As they walked back to the apartment through a park carpeted with fallen leaves, Alex was uncharacteristically quiet, processing the morning's revelations. Dad, he finally asked, kicking at a pile of leaves, if you find out you have a kid, are you automatically good at being a father? The question's complexity belied Alex's young age. No, Richard answered honestly. Being a father is like any important role. It takes learning, practice, and the willingness to make mistakes and grow from them. Alex considered this. Are you still learning? Every day, Richard confirmed, and I probably always will be. This seemed to satisfy Alex, who nodded thoughtfully. Mom used to say that the best scientists keep learning their whole lives. That when you think you know everything, that's when you stop making discoveries. Your mother was very wise, Richard said. The familiar pang of missing Katherine's wisdom mingled now with gratitude for the insights she had instilled in their son. As they reached the apartment building, Alex suddenly took Richard's hand, a spontaneous gesture of connection that had been rare in their early relationship. I'm glad you're learning to be my dad, he said simply. That evening, Susan returned home to find Richard and Alex surrounded by boxes of photographs and mementos spread across the living room floor. The memory project had expanded throughout the afternoon, with Richard ordering pizzas for dinner to avoid disrupting their work. What's all this? Susan asked, surveying the creative chaos. We're making our family history, Alex explained excitedly. Dad brought some cool stuff from New York. Look at this. It's his first computer chip design from when he was in college. Susan raised an eyebrow at Richard, who shrugged with a smile. We got a bit carried away. Good days. As the three of them continued sorting through memories, Katherine's scientific awards beside Richard's early patents, family photographs from both sides, treasured objects that told the story of two separate lives that had briefly intersected and created Alex. Richard felt a profound sense of peace settle over him. The path forward wasn't without its challenges. There would be difficult conversations about where and how Alex would divide his time as he grew older. There would be moments when Richard's business responsibilities would create conflicts, when Susan's legal career would require accommodations, when Alex's needs would test them both. The balance they had begun to establish remained delicate, requiring constant attention and care. But for now, in this moment, Richard Bryant, billionaire CEO, notorious workaholic, and unlikely late-blooming father, found himself exactly where he needed to be. Not in a boardroom negotiating a merger, not in a lab overseeing the next technological breakthrough, but sitting cross-legged on the floor of a Chicago apartment, helping his son build a bridge between past and future. 1 year to the day since Alex had delivered Katherine's letter, Richard stood at the edge of Lake Michigan, watching his son skip stones across the calm surface. The spring sun warmed their shoulders as Alex searched for the perfect flat rock, his methodical assessment making Richard smile. Some traits were undeniably genetic. "I got 7 skips that time," Alex called proudly. "That's my new record." "Impressive," Richard acknowledged. "I never managed more than 5 when I was your age." Today marked not only the anniversary of their first meeting, but also the official opening of the Katherine Winters Environmental Research Center at the University of Chicago. The ceremony would begin in a few hours, bringing together academic leaders, environmental scientists, and the first cohort of scholarship recipients, all made possible by the foundation Richard had established. Alex logged another stone, achieving only 3 skips this time. "Do you think Mom would like what you've done?" he asked, his back still turned to Richard. "With the research center and everything?" The question carried weight beyond its simple phrasing. Though they spoke of Katherine often, her memory integrated into their daily lives rather than treated as a forbidden topic. Alex still occasionally sought reassurance that the new patterns they had established honored her legacy. "I think she would," Richard answered thoughtfully. "Not because of the building or the funding, but because of what it represents, continuing the work she cared about, supporting other scientists who share her vision." Alex nodded, seemingly satisfied. He had participated in many of the planning discussions for the center over the past months, his input taken seriously despite his young age. Richard had been consistently impressed by his son's insights, particularly his suggestion to include a mentorship program pairing established researchers with middle and high school students interested in environmental science. "Ready to head back?" Richard asked, checking his watch. Susan would be meeting them at the apartment, where they would all change for the ceremony. "Almost," Alex replied, scanning the shoreline until he found one more perfect skipping stone. His final throw achieved 5 clean skips before the stone disappeared beneath the water's surface. As they walked back toward the car, Alex asked casually, "How long are you staying this time?" The question reflected their evolving arrangement over the past year. Richard now split his time between New York and Chicago, with technology allowing him to lead Bryant Technologies remotely for extended periods. The Chicago office had grown from a convenient excuse to a thriving operation, focusing on sustainable technology applications, while Alex had visited New York during school breaks, gradually becoming comfortable in Richard's penthouse apartment. "Actually," Richard began, "I wanted to discuss something with you and Aunt Susan together, but since you've asked..." He paused, gauging Alex's readiness for what he was about to propose. "I'm considering making Chicago my primary residence." Alex stopped walking, his expression a mixture of surprise and cautious hope. "Really? What about your company?" The New York operations would continue with the executive team handling day-to-day management. I'd commute there regularly, but base myself here. Because of me? Alex asked directly, his perceptiveness as sharp as ever. Largely, yes, Richard confirmed, knowing his son deserved honesty, but also because the work we're doing at the Chicago office has become increasingly important to me, and because I've come to value the life we've built here. Alex absorbed this, his face thoughtful. Would you live with us? In Mom's apartment? The question touched on discussions that Richard, Susan, and family therapists had been navigating carefully. The current arrangement, Richard staying in Katherine's apartment during his Chicago visits while maintaining his own residence in New York, had provided stability during the transition. But as their family unit had evolved, so too had the possibilities for their living situation. That's something we should discuss with Aunt Susan, Richard said carefully. There are several options we could consider. What matters most is what makes you comfortable. Alex nodded, accepting the measured response. As they continued toward the car, he slipped his hand into Richard's, a gesture that had become more natural over time, but still carried special significance. Back at the apartment, Susan was already there, hanging up a phone call as they entered. That was the caterer confirming everything set for the reception, she reported, their organized efficiency having proven invaluable in planning the day's events. The relationship between Richard and Susan had developed into a respectful partnership that occasionally surprised them both. Their shared dedication to Alex's well-being had gradually expanded to include genuine friendship, their different perspectives and strengths complementing rather than conflicting. How was your morning at the lake? Susan asked Alex, helping him locate the tie he would need for the ceremony. Good. Dad told me he's thinking about moving to Chicago permanently, Alex reported matter-of-factly. Susan's eyes met Richard's over Alex's head, a complex communication passing between them. They had discussed this possibility privately, weighing the implications for all three of them. We were going to talk about that after today's events, Richard explained. It's still in the planning stages. Susan nodded, understanding his caution. Well, since it's now on the table, perhaps we should all sit down for a minute before we get ready. They gathered in the living room, the same space where Alex had first shown Richard the letter from Katherine, where they had spent countless evenings building projects and sharing meals over the past year. I've been offered a partnership at my firm, Susan began, surprising both Richard and Alex with this unexpected announcement. It would mean more responsibility, more income, but also more demanding hours. Richard immediately understood the connection to his own news. You're concerned about how that would affect your ability to be present for Alex if you're both working more intensively. Susan nodded. Exactly. I've been hesitant to accept because of that concern. But if you're seriously considering relocating to Chicago, I am, Richard confirmed, and I would want to be more than just physically present. I'm prepared to take on primary parenting responsibilities when your work requires it. Alex looked between them, processing the implications of these adult decisions on his life. So, what would change exactly? It was a fair question, and one they had all been carefully considering from different angles. Potentially, our living arrangements, Richard acknowledged. There are several possibilities we could consider. I could purchase a home nearby, allowing you to maintain your connection to your mother's apartment, while giving us more space when we're all together. Or we could look at other options, if that would make more sense for everyone. Susan added gently, whatever we decide, Alex, it would be with your input. We know how important stability is, especially after everything you've been through. Alex considered this with the serious thoughtfulness that characterized his approach to important matters. I like our apartment because it was Mom's, he said finally, but sometimes it feels sad too, like we're trying to keep everything the same when it isn't. The insight struck both adults with its simple wisdom. Katherine's presence would always be honored in their lives, but perhaps preserving her physical space exactly as it had been was not the only or best way to honor her memory. What if, Richard suggested carefully, we found a new place that had room for all of us, but brought special things from here to make it feel connected to your mom? Her books, her favorite furniture, photographs, Alex seemed to find comfort in this compromise. Could we still be near my school and friends? Absolutely, Richard assured him. That would be a priority. As they continued discussing possibilities, Richard marveled at how far they had come in a year's time. From the shock of discovering he had a son to this thoughtful family discussion about their shared future, the journey had transformed him in ways he never could have anticipated. Later, as they prepared for the ceremony, Richard helped Alex with his tie, a skill he had specifically learned for occasions like this. The boy stood patiently as Richard adjusted the knot, his expression reflective. "Dad?" he asked suddenly. "Do you think things happen for a reason?" Richard paused, sensing the philosophical weight behind the seemingly simple question. "That's a complex idea," he replied carefully. "I believe that meaning often comes from how we respond to what happens, rather than from the events themselves." Alex nodded, processing this. "Mom used to say something similar, that science is about understanding what happens, but wisdom is about what we do with that understanding." "She was right," Richard said softly, the familiar ache of Katherine's absence balanced now by gratitude for her lasting influence in their son's thoughtful mind. The ceremony at the university exceeded all expectations. As Richard stood at the podium to officially dedicate the Katherine Winters Environmental Research Center, he surveyed the audience where Alex and Susan sat in the front row. Beside them were several of Katherine's former colleagues, many of whom had shared stories with Alex over the past year, helping him understand his mother's professional legacy. Katherine Winters believed that scientific advancement should serve humanity's highest aspirations, Richard stated, his voice steady and clear. She understood that true progress meant creating solutions that harmonized with the natural world rather than exploiting it. This center will continue that vision, supporting researchers committed to sustainable innovation. As he spoke, Richard felt Katherine's presence not as a painful absence, but as an enduring inspiration for the work the center would accomplish, for the son they had created together, and for the man Richard was still becoming. After the formal proceedings, during the reception, Alex proudly gave several of Katherine's colleagues a tour of the center's youth education laboratory, which had been designed with his input. Richard watched from a distance, giving his son space to shine in this moment that so beautifully connected his past and future. Susan joined him, handing him a glass of sparkling water. "You've done something remarkable here," she said, gesturing around them. "Not just the center, but with Alex. Katherine would be amazed at how you've stepped into fatherhood." "I've had excellent guidance," Richard acknowledged, his respect for Susan's role in Alex's life genuine and deep. "We make a good team." They stood in companionable silence, watching Alex enthusiastically explain the planned mentorship program to an impressed university dean. "I've decided to accept the partnership," Susan said finally. "And I think your idea of finding a new place that works for all of us makes sense. A fresh start that honors the past without being bound by it." Richard nodded, understanding the significance of her decision. "I'll have my real estate team prepare some options for us to consider together." As the reception drew to a close, Alex rejoined them, his expression bright with excitement and the satisfaction of honoring his mother's legacy. "Dr. Chen said I could intern in her lab when I'm in high school," he reported proudly. "She said my coding skills would be really valuable for their climate modeling projects." "That's wonderful," Richard said, his hand resting lightly on his son's shoulder. "Your mother would be so proud of you." Of both of us, I think, Alex replied with quiet certainty. We're figuring out how to be a family. The simple statement captured the essence of their journey over the past year, the gradual, sometimes difficult process of creating something new and meaningful from unexpected circumstances. That evening, after returning to the apartment, Richard found himself alone on the balcony, looking out at the Chicago skyline, illuminated against the night sky. The day's events had stirred complex emotions, pride in what they had accomplished, lingering sadness for Katherine's absence, and profound gratitude for the son who connected them. He heard the balcony door slide open behind him and turned to find Alex in his pajamas, holding 2 mugs of hot chocolate. "I thought you might want some," the boy explained, offering one of the mugs. "Aunt Susan's already asleep." "Thank you," Richard said, accepting the drink with appreciation for the thoughtful gesture. Alex settled into the chair beside him, both of them gazing out at the city lights in comfortable silence. "I found something today," Alex said eventually, pulling a folded paper from his pocket. "It was in one of Mom's old journals that Dr. Chen returned to me at the ceremony." He handed the paper to Richard, who unfolded it carefully. It was a note written in Katherine's elegant handwriting, dated just weeks before her death. "My dearest Alex, if you're reading this, you've already begun to know your father." Richard was a man of remarkable determination and intelligence, but also of deeper qualities that few people recognized beneath his success. "I see these qualities in you every day. Your curiosity, your persistence, your capacity to care deeply about important things. I made choices that kept you apart, choices I believed were right at the time. Now, as my perspective changes, I hope you will both find in each other what I cherished in each of you. Learn from him, but also teach him. You have so much to offer each other. All my love, always, Mom." Richard read the note twice, emotion making it difficult to maintain his composure. Katherine's final gift to them both, her blessing for the relationship they were building, her recognition of what they might become to each other. "She knew," Alex said quietly. "Even before she sent me to find you, she knew we'd be okay together." Richard nodded, unable to speak for a moment as he carefully refolded the precious note and returned it to his son. When he finally found his voice, he said simply, "Your mother was the wisest person I've ever known, and the bravest." "She said the same about you once," Alex replied. "I remember asking her why there were no pictures of my dad, and she said you were living your own important journey, but that you were the bravest person she'd ever met, because you had overcome so much to become who you were." The revelation of Katherine's words, preserved in their son's memory, completed a circle that had begun with that first letter. Despite the years of separation, despite the missed opportunities and regrets, Katherine had maintained a thread of connection between them, one that had ultimately brought father and son together. As they sat side by side, watching the city below and the stars above, Richard Bryant, once defined solely by his wealth and corporate power, understood that his true legacy was not the empire he had built, but the relationship he was continuing to build with his son. The most valuable inheritance he could offer Alex was not financial security, but the steadfast presence of a father who had learned, however belatedly, what truly mattered. And in that quiet moment of understanding, Richard felt Katherine's presence one last time, not as a ghost of regret, but as the gentle hand that had guided them both to this new beginning. "I've reached the end of this story, but I want it to continue through you. If this narrative touched your heart or made you reflect on your own choices, become part of our community of storytellers. Touch the subscription button. This small gesture means so much to me. Share in the comments which moment of this journey resonated most with you, and if you've ever experienced something similar in your own life. Your stories are the true treasure of this channel, and that's why we continue here, week after week, sharing these narratives that remind us of what really matters. Until the next story, which I promise will be as special as you, who came all this way with me.